Hello and welcome to India Hangouts. 7 years have passed since terrorists unleashed one of their deadliest and most audacious attacks in India's commercial capital, killing 164, wounding 308 in Mumbai. The terrorists, who hailed from Pakistan, sailed in on a boat, landed in South Mumbai and then went on to wreak destruction with guns and bombs. Weeks ago, terrorists unleashed a similar attack in some ways in Paris, killing 129. Gunmen sprayed crowds of young people at a concert hall and in restaurants with AK-47s. Many compared that Paris attack modus operandi with Mumbai, and terrorist groups have threatened that more are coming. Which brings us to the question today: is India any safer today from such attacks? What is our preparedness? What more needs to be done to make our country and our citizens safer? To discuss this, I am joined by Captain Raghu Raman, former CEO of NatGrid, and Samir Patil of Gateway House, who is also has worked with the National Security Agency. Thank you very much for joining us. So let me begin with you and ask you the broad question that we are starting with today. Are we safer today?
Well, the answer to that, as most such questions are, is yes and no. So, are we safer today if we get another attack like a 26/11? Yes, we are. Provided the terrorists follow exactly the same narrative as 26/11 and attack only 5-star hotels. But if they decide to attack Jazz by the Bay or any one of the open-air restaurants, then we are exactly where we were. I mean, at least insofar as the attack is concerned. Our response may be faster. The psyche of the people would be very different. The cooperation with the security agencies would be much better now. People will not be blindsided. Probably the NSG will respond in a much faster time. But all of that still depends on a very big assumption that we will fight the next battle along the same narrative of the last battle, which is not at all the scenario. If you look at the terror attacks, they may have a common flavor, they may have a common sort of structure and a foundation, but even varying a little bit, let's say you vary the target. Instead of 5-star hotels, you attack open places. Instead of well-guarded parliaments, you attack unguarded schools. Then the entire narrative of being prepared takes a
So let me add an element to that question. So one of the questions being asked in France, for instance, is whether there was sufficient intelligence and whether it's an intelligence failure. Maybe the response was good or as best as it could be, but there could have been an intelligence gap. Would we face a similar challenge?
I think all countries would face a challenge of having the fact remains, when you have proliferation of attacks. Two things are different with the Paris attack, and most people haven't sort of commented on it. And it's important to understand the nuanced difference between the Paris attack and the attack that happened in Mumbai. The one that happened in Mumbai was commanded and controlled by a set of professional handlers, by obviously very good specialists in commando raids who were directing these dumb weapons, so to speak. Well-trained people, motivated jihadis who are going to die at the end of it. But they were being commanded and controlled literally step by step. They were even being, I mean, you I'm sure must have heard the transcripts where even in terms of when to kill the hostages was being controlled by them. That's like a missile which is being remotely piloted. The one that happened in Paris is a fire and forget missile, where you have trained a bunch of people, you have launched them into the theater of operations, and they are pretty much running on their own. Right. That's like a self-guided missile. Now, these are two different formats, and the latter format is much easier to execute because you can create multiple such teams. You can teach them how to procure weapons locally, you can teach them how to prepare explosives locally, and then they have their own timetable, they have their own sets of targets, and they can improvise and modify as they go along.
Right. Okay. So we'll come to what's going to become a bigger challenge then in this form of terrorism that we are likely to face. Samir, if you were to look at the operational responses after 26/11 and the strategic build-up, strategic sort of thinking that followed after that, how would you sum it up?
Well, I look at the response to 26/11 and what we did after that in terms of two categories. One is the structural category where, there have been steps taken like the setting up of the NatGrid, the setting up of the National Investigation Agency, and also steps taken on the terrorist financing by beefing up the financial intelligence units, India chapter and all that. But there are also some lesser known public steps. For instance, the setting up of the multi-agency center, which brought together all the 26 and more than the 26 security agencies together, so that they can share the information on counterterrorism and talk to each other, and then discuss comprehensively the terror threat posed to India. And the other is in terms of the operations. For instance, after 26/11, we have done a series of operations whereby we have neutralized some of the important terrorist commanders which were involved in the Mumbai attacks. The arrest of Yasin Bhatkal, the arrest of Abu Jundal, and as well as a couple of other people, including Sarfaraz Nawaz from UAE, who was a key elite recruiter. So those kind of steps have really helped us to neutralize the terrorist commanders. And the steps that we took in Nepal and Bangladesh, of course with the cooperation of the local government there, has in a sense helped us to at least contain the ecosystem there, so that the anti-India terrorist groups operating in these parts cannot really again do something like that. So I look at these two steps together. But of course, as Captain Raman said, that much needs to be done more. And in fact, I'm going to point out two specific examples where how the steps that have taken have not really been proved effective. One is the much reported case of Jihadi Biswas, the guy that despite the fact that we enhanced our technical surveillance after Mumbai. The guy continued to run the Twitter account for 4 years without our security agencies getting any vis of it.
We got an alert from outside.
Inside, we got an alert from not only from security agency but from media organization.
Yeah.
So that is something which is worrying. And the second is, if you look at, for instance, the coastal security. After Mumbai, there has been a lot of focus on the coastal security. The Mumbai police purchasing the fast interceptor boats and all those. But again, if you look at the information which came last year, the boats were purchased, but the fuel for these boats was never sanctioned by the state government, and therefore those boats were never used. And if you just have to travel some 30 kilometers from Bombay, and you look at some of the smaller ports outside the Bombay's territory, those are still poorly managed. And in fact, then we can see, for instance, in 1993, when the explosives were smuggled into those through porous coasts, something can be repeated again. Therefore, much more needs to be done.
Okay, so you talked about the internet, and let's quickly touch upon that as well. So that's one area where the nature of the threat has changed quite dramatically, right? Because here you have the internet being used to actually seed and recruit potential terrorists, and then let them loose. So what's your sense, Captain? Between the challenges which are the traditional ones along with the new ones, what's the bigger challenge that we're facing today?
I think it's not a question of bigger or smaller. I think there is a doctrine shift. There is a paradigm shift which is happening. And this is, by the way, nothing new. Because the thing is that we get fascinated by terrorism and start treating it as a separate creature. It's not. It's a tool of war. It's a tool by which a body of people who are much smaller in number or are of inferior strength in terms of resources can exert a compellence on a much larger numerical force. And if we take that as a definition, you realize that as doctrines changed, when theaters changed, so from land to sea, from sea to air, from air to space were the four major changes, and then you have cyberspace, which is the fifth one. In all these theaters of war, the end effect, the terminal effect is kinetic energy. You are causing damage. But in social media, which is the sixth dimension, ought to be treated as the sixth dimension, the target is the psyche of the people. It is the will of the people. It is the sense of helplessness. So let me give you a very simple example. I mean, it may sound a little counterintuitive, but the fact is that any soldier will tell you that if you take a killing, which is a slitting of a throat of a person, takes about a half a minute for the person to die, and it is obviously a gruesome death. Compare that with being imprisoned and tortured for years and then being killed. Obviously, the former is a more humane. And I know what I'm saying is obviously in relative terminology.
Sure.
But the first instance causes a brisance effect. It causes a sort of an explosive effect in the media. This is battle of the mind. This is the ultimate psychological operations at work. And that requires a very different doctrine. You can't block. I mean, the US has not been able to block the Twitter accounts of the ISIS. And ISIS largely operates out of Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. You whack one down, three more spring up. It requires a completely different doctrinal shift. We can't be fighting an air battle using the doctrine of land. We can't be fighting a sea battle using the doctrine of space. Similarly, I don't think we can be looking at fighting this battle, which is a battle for the mind. where you're making people feel helpless, people feel scared, people feel terrorized by using doctrines of blockage, prevention, not allowing people to come in, not allowing a David Headley to come in. That doctrine will not work here. Here it has to be more in terms of awareness levels, making people aware, involving this battle. The battlefield is civilian.
Right. Yeah.
The combatants are civilian. So you have to enroll civilians on your side and explain to them that when these kind of messages come, or these kind of fear mongering is being created, the purpose is to create that fear mongering, and it may not have substance. You take one clip, like the ISIS does it very well. They take one clip, they shoot it from 5-6 I mean, as professional as it gets, and then they upload it in high definition. They have subtitles and dubbing done in 6-7 different languages. This is a campaign of a different doctrine. It has to be fought with a different doctrine. That doctrinal shift is something that needs to sink in. It's happening to a certain extent.
You're saying in India or the world?
I think in India also it's happening. I mean, I was recently in a conference in Delhi which was discussing, and obviously it was spurred by two factors. One was the Paris attack, and second is obviously its anniversary of 26/11. The dialogues nowadays are not so much about bulletproof jackets and CCTV cameras, and of course there is a little bit of this implementation issues, which is the problem of India. It's not just problem of Indian security. We have ideation here and implementation here, and this gap is something that we have not been able to cover across spectrums, whether it's in not necessarily in security, in anything. But having said that, the discussions are much more on collaboration. The discussion is on the spaces of how do different agencies collaborate better, how do agencies across the globe exchange information. I think there is a realization now, not just in India, I think globally, that the world is one battlefield. So a blueprint that will be tried and tested in Mumbai will very quickly be rolled out in other parts. A terrorist who is freed in a Kandahar hijack will end up killing Daniel Pearl. So I think that realization that you can't say this is a local problem of one country, I think that realization is sunk in.
Right. Okay, Samir, you talked about the new agencies that have been launched. There is the National Technical Research Organization, which looks at the cyber part of it. There is, of course, NatGrid, the man who headed it is sitting right next to you. But why don't you look at all of them together and tell us how sort of comfortable or secure can I feel as a citizen today that all these agencies are doing something every day, and you worked with one as well. That every day that really is ensuring that either our borders are safe, or even if our borders are not safe, our cities are safe and our lives are safe.
So let's go back to the example that I gave, the multi-agency center. In a sense, that's where I also, in a sense, worked for some time. So the multi-agency center really brings together all the counter-terrorism information, related information on one single table. Because one of the problems that we faced during Mumbai was that that there were disparate pieces of information on the impending attack, but there was no single agency which could bring those together and put up a comprehensive picture, and that's not what the MIC is trying to do. So there is a daily meeting which happens where all the security agencies try to discuss this threat, and then after that the discussion, the alerts are then passed on to the let's say the first responders if there is an attack, and then those agencies are supposed to be acting on those pieces of information. The second is that for the faster dissemination of the information, now they have set up a network like NatGrid to pass on that information so that there is no delay in terms of sending the information, and they can really act on that information, and that can work on a 24/7 basis. And then there is also the terrorist financing issue. So the financial intelligence unit now completely monitors all the suspicious activities, suspicious financial transactions, and then forms a daily report and then sends it to the finance ministry so that any unusual activity can be noted and then can be acted upon. So in that sense, our agencies are trying to get our act together.
Right. So, and this is at the federal level, right? So
yes.
how do you see this, going from the federal to the state, and our states also are responding or likely to respond as swiftly and efficiently?
So in terms of the state machinery, obviously because each of the federal agencies have their subsidiary units in all the state capitals. So in that sense, the dissemination of information happens at the state level also. And then those state units are then linked to all the state level law enforcement agencies, the Maharashtra Police or the Maharashtra ATS, the Mumbai Police and the Mumbai ATS. So in that sense, that flow of information has been guaranteed. The second is in terms of the coordination, and that's where I think there's a little bit of problem, because what happens is most of the times the cooperation happens only on paper, but that has not been like an institutional rule, and that's what I think the setting up of the National Counter-Terrorism Center was supposed to do, that have an agency which will be a center of joint operational planning and joint counterterrorism thing. Because if you look at the existing agencies, the Intelligence Bureau, the RAW and all that, all these agencies, the IB is, for instance, a nodal agency for counterterrorism, but IB has no legal character. But other agencies like RAW and the military intelligence and all these agencies do counterterrorism as a part of their broader organizational mandate, and that's where the problem is, and that's what NCTC was supposed to do. And but the thing is,
so are we likely to see the NCTC come into being?
That's what I'm coming to point, saying that maybe I think it's sad to say, but maybe like another Mumbai type of attack probably again will propel our the political machinery to set up that kind of agency.
Okay, Captain, can I ask you a slightly different question? What is our attitude when it comes to this? Different countries respond differently. Even France, to many people's surprise, has responded in a far more aggressive way than perhaps people thought they would. They've declared emergency internally, they've gone and bombed Syria. In India too, sometimes there is an expectation that we should be doing things differently and reacting differently. What is our mindset today? And do we look at this as aggressors or defenders or passive or neutral? And what should we be doing about that if we are really to sort of take on the challenge and make people also think twice about doing something?
So there are two ways to look at it. One way is, so factually I don't agree that France initiated bombings in Syria. Those targets were always in the French list. They just upped the...
that's what I mean. Basically, so but it happened immediately.
It was already there. So it was not like it was it shouldn't be compared with the 9/11 attacks in the US, where there was a air campaign that was started against Taliban and bombing them into the Stone Age or whatever. So my sense is that if you look at a terror attack, put yourself in the terrorist shoes and see what is the strategic objective of that terror attack. It's not to kill 160 people or 127 people. You lose more of that number in 15 minutes in traffic accidents. The purpose is to terrorize. That's why aircraft is much more lucrative than killing people on ground, and that's why killing defenseless children is much more, has a much more terrorizing effect than bombing, say, a bus full of army men. The best response that a nation should have is not to respond. Because if you respond to a terrorist provocation by whatever, whether it's direct or indirect, whether it's state or citizens, people having Islamophobia being amplified, or we don't want Syrian refugees in our country, this is all a response. It's direct, indirect response. Now, to some extent, and I don't think it's a very planned way, India is usually slow and measured in its response. It's not that one end of the spectrum is ready, fire, aim. We don't do that. We don't go out guns blazing to look at any moving target and say, we got to get scalp, we need blood. We don't do that, and I think that's a good strategy, because we have seen how such strategies fail, where you use heavy force and actually make more enemies. And I think the US is a classic example of having to live through the aftermath of their first wave of strategies with the second wave and the third wave, and each time the number of adversaries keep increasing. They don't actually reduce. Having said that, I believe it's also time for us to become slightly more firm. And when I mean firm, I don't mean firm in that instance. I mean firm in a resolution that whatever we start, we will end it. We will not announce structures. We will not make these grand proclamations that we are going to do this and do that and then allow it to fizzle down. I think that is an area where India needs to sort of really step up. So we talk about structures, but we don't look at the underlying foundations that are required to make those structures work. We talk about creating...
Give me an example.
I'll give you an example. So for instance, if we say that we need to, like the US, leverage national capacity in 9/11, they needed to fight using technology. And they created structures which will enable leveraging of national capacity by public-private partnership. Matter of fact, the tool that runs the counter-terrorism center in the US is a tool called the Palantir, and that was made by a group of people who were
big data guys,
big data guys from PayPal.
Yeah.
They moved from PayPal, It was funded, the tool was funded by In-Q-Tel, which is a CIA subsidiary and an openly traded subsidiary in the market. They put those structures in place. They put structures by which they could leverage national capacity. We talk about leveraging national capacity, but there isn't any structure in bits and pieces, and you're aware of it, where you try to leverage national talent into the government. There is no structure. So these pronouncements of grandeur, they start wearing thin, and people start realizing that this is all talk, but none of these structures.
So you're saying, so therefore, I mean, coming back to the original question about, how comprehensively are we responding? So Samir, I think, made a few points about agencies talking together and so on. You said about our overall operational responsiveness being much sharper than it was surely then when the last attack happened. But what is perhaps missing is the larger structures to create new innovation, ideas, people, bring them together, create.
I think what is missing is our resoluteness over a period of time. Okay. So we do react, and we do, sort of get into the fervor of reaction in the immediate aftermath, whether it was the Mumbai bombings in '93 and 26/11 or whatever after that. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. In this, you got to pace yourself for the next 40 kilometers and say whether it's in terms of funding, mind share, diktats, processes. They can't keep altering every 6 months or with every change of government or with every flavor of the season. It can't. So right now the focus is on this kind of terrorism. Can we afford to take our eye off the Naxal problem? We can't, because that is another terrorist problem that we are facing. So we can't keep shifting our heavy artillery from one location to another just because that happens. So I think what we need is a directional vision for an extended period of time. It's a 6 feet ditch. You have to take a 6 feet leap. You can't say I will leap in 3 feet once and then 3 feet later. It doesn't work. So I think that directional stability with a long-term vision is what we lack.
Okay. So let's sort of touch upon that as we sort of run to the end of the show. Samir, if I were to ask you to describe your ideal world where, we feel safe because the country and the people who are ruling it are taking effective steps to counter terrorism, what would they be?
So I look at it in terms of three concepts, and which are, in a sense, which Captain Raman also alluded to earlier. First is, a comprehensive definition of terrorism itself, because in today's world, you really cannot have a definition of a good terrorist and a bad terrorist. There has to be a comprehensive definition, and that's where I think this particular current government, has, in a sense, taken a right line, saying that that we really need to push for the UN Convention, the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, because that's where no distinction will be made in terms of a state-sponsored terrorism as well as a state involvement in terrorist activities. The second is terrorist financing, and I spoke about the Financial Intelligence Unit, but so far what has happened is that the focus is more in terms of the formal financial system. But at least in the case of South Asia, the terrorist groups are really adept in using the informal financial systems such as Hawala, such as Hundi, and no amount of effective bilateral cooperation has been able to tackle that challenge. And the third is the cybersecurity. Captain Raman talked about the public-private partnership in responding to terrorist challenges, but we also have to look at in terms of that the next terrorist attack could not be a physical attack launched by an armed raid or a cross-border raid, but it could be just a cyber intrusion into your critical infrastructure, and that can, in a sense, create havoc in that sense. So, cybersecurity cooperation and focus on counterterrorism are some of the issues that need to be dealt with.
Okay, Captain.
Well, there's a
the vision that you talked about.
The slew of tactical and operational measures that can be done. But I think if we want, first I think we have to recognize that this is a perpetual problem. I don't think, as a military.
And therefore you're also saying that we are not perhaps recognizing it as well.
No, I don't think we are recognizing. I think as a former military person, and I know there are a lot of serving military personnel who may not agree with me on this count, but I don't think we are looking at a 3 armored divisions war with Pakistan anymore. So to have these 3 divisions stationed in various parts of India and hope that they will be leveraged and that will be our battle in the future, I doubt that. I think we are going to see terrorism as a perpetual problem in our ecosystem. It's all over the world now. There isn't a country that you can talk about as being insulated from it. So it's a worldwide phenomenon now. If that be the case, I think what we need is an evolution of a different doctrine. We need so about 4-5 steps. First, we need to evolve a new doctrine to recognize that this is a different battle in a different dimension, different theater. It requires different kind of warriors, different kind of thinkers, different kind of generals. You can't take a general who fights a fixed battle in land and put him in charge of an abstract battle of psychological operations. It's not going to work. He's still going to look for a material target to liquidate, and he's not going to find it, right? and he'll liquidate a lot of collateral in the bargain. That's point number one. Point number two, I think we have now got to co-opt the private institutions, not just in the battle against terrorism, but also recognizing that tomorrow if a private sector telecom is attacked, or a private sector energy company is attacked, or a private sector school is attacked, it's an airline is attacked, it's a national attack. So there is no distinction between a target on this side and a public or a private target. Right. So if you are safeguarding, say for example, a government institution with armed guards, it's the same rationale to say at least the same level of security needs to come in some of the other strategic pieces as well. Third, I think, is the involvement of people. We train our children in finishing schools and good diction, but our children don't know what to do in a stampede. We train them in how to behave with people and how to be knowledgeable about world affairs. They can't understand even the fundamental problems that India is facing in terms of terrorism. So I think we need to now push down. I mean, it's a very interesting anecdote that officers of the GCHQ, which is sort of UK's premier institution against counter-terror, they actually go to kindergarten schools and teach children mathematics because they are looking at creating cryptographers 20 years down the line. I think we need to have that vision. We need to recognize that if this problem is something that our children's children will still be facing, we need to start building the foundations of curing this problem in a systematic manner today. It can't be a knee-jerk reaction that if it's a hotel is attacked, we'll protect the hotel, school is attacked, we'll that's
right.
That's a zero-sum game.
It goes back to the point that we started with. So I hate to end with 30-second responses, but let me try and end with a question at least along those lines. Are we safer today?
To some extent, yes.
Okay.
So, but much more needs to be done because, as I always say, that the security agencies need to be successful 100%, but the terrorists need to be successful only once.
Okay, Captain.
We are definitely safer today, and I think it's unfortunate. I mean, this is a cliche what I'm telling you, that agencies stop 9 attacks which we can't talk about. They can't talk about. They can't advertise. Even the 10th one that gets through is far more subdued in its impact because of these 9 or because of several other things which have happened. They are forced to change their tactics from doing a military raid, which is a command and control raid, because this interception capability is now known. And so they have to have self-contained teams. That's a much lower, that's why in Paris, one of the reasons I believe that they were not able to sustain the attack for a long period as they were able to do here, because they were getting instructions on how to do it. I think the agencies are doing a fantastic job. And at times I think they need a little bit of encouragement as well. But the fact is that are we going to have a zero incident ever? That's an unrealistic aim. It's not going to happen. Anybody who promises that is not making a realistic promise, because 1, 2 will always get through.
Right.
And that's the price that we will have to pay for this new format of war that we are forced into.
Right. So very grim, but at least sober that we are in realization of what the larger challenge is. Our ability to handle it has improved. We are also stopping things from happening, which may not get publicized in the manner that we are used to seeing things get publicized once they happen. So that's the good news. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all we have time on the India Hangout. We'll be back soon. Thanks for watching.